importance of the book series. This is probably the happiest you're going to see the series at the end, and then it gets really dark after this. Starting with book 4, the book series makes a real turn into more, I would definitely say, Gothic literature style, and much more dark. And from book 4 on, we're really dealing with some very serious, I mean, we're dealing with some very serious things here, but it gets even much darker. So I'm not going to spoil book 4. Okay. All right. Okay, we talked about the connection to book 3 and book 5, and how they're very similar, with, you know, how they mirror each other or echo each other. We talked about that, and that there's a lot, okay, as well. We talked about some of the themes in the series. We talked about how this really mirrors book 5 in the theme area as well too. I think all of these themes show up in book 5 as well, in one way or another. Symbols and devices, we talked about that. We talked about illusions, how, for example, there are allusions to Aunt Marge being like the Prime Minister of England in the 1980s, Margaret Thatcher. So a lot of that was involved in the creation of the series. So look for all those allusions as you're continuing to read the series. Okay, and then we talked about how it's still in the same genres, right? Children's literature, it's still fantasy, adventure, a little bit more coming of age. It's still a detective mystery novel. It's very like mystery, like Nancy Drew, Hardy Boys kind of thing. That's like the American version of this, and a little sci-fi. And I say sci-fi because at the end of the book series, we have time travel. And once I see time travel in something, it's sci-fi for me. There's a great book I read last year, The Life of Something LaRue, and it wasn't time travel as much as it was like immortality. Immortality adds to the sci-fi as well, but anytime there's something like that, I always think there's time travel. There's another character that she ends up being somebody, becomes immortal, and she ends up living from like the 1600s in France all the way until modern times. And then there's a whole, I gotta remember the name of the book. It's actually quite good. It's one of my apps in my Libby app. I always keep everything in my Libby app of what I've read as well. So everything I've borrowed is in here. I just got to go back through like 100 books. I made a commitment in the last, The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue. So if you want something that's kind of cool, it's really great in audiobook format. Addie LaRue is really vivid, and I had an interesting story to it. Okay, so if you like the idea of somebody going through time, that's another one. Okay, so, all right. We talked about some preview questions. We talked about there's going to be some growth in this novel of Harry, Ron, and Hermione together. They start to take things a little bit more seriously around them. Not that they didn't before, but like I think something happens when you turn 13. They're 13 now. They're teenagers. And they start seeing that the world is, in the first 2 books, they still seem naive and innocent. Here, they start seeing that not all things are naive and innocent. And I think that also happens in book 5. There's a huge growth of the characters in book 5 because of what they experienced in book 4. And so year 4 was very critical in building their development for book 5. Okay. As well. So we see a lot of that. By book 5, they are also 15-year-olds. Do you remember when you were 15? Maybe you're close to that age. 15 is, you kind of like know what the world's like now. You're not that naive, right? Okay. The other thing is I think I love how she names the titles of the books. All right. So we're just gonna jump in. I stopped, I believe, in chapter 2, chapter 3. We know that Harry blows up Aunt Marge. Does he do it on purpose? Does he blow Aunt Marge on purpose? Thank you for answering. Yeah, no, he does do it on purpose. So, he really you can see, because he doesn't blow her up on purpose, what I always think is he is still this like 13-year-old who is really still trying to control his magic. And he had a moment where he was not able to control his magic and really get an idea of that, of the consequences, right? And he gets in trouble for this, in a way. And he does leave his house. And the last thing I read to you when we left on Friday was how he ended up on Magnolia Crescent. It's like a little neighborhood. Now, one of the other things that happens a lot in this book is all the references to the moon and to the night throughout the series, throughout this book, right? There's a lot of references to that with Magnolia Crescent, as in crescent moon. So you're going to see that a lot. Okay. Harry leaves the house in a reckless rage, as it says on at least on my page 30, in a reckless rage, which is the last basic paragraph of chapter 2. And right, were you ever reckless at age 13? Do you think you ever had a reckless rage at age 13? Probably. Yeah. I think my son did too. I probably did too. I remember once I got into a big fight with my mother. I wanted to go out with my friends, but my aunt was in town from New York, and I kept like nagging my mother. And I was so angry, and I was like, Mom, it's not fair. And I was like, I make these plans. I don't want to cancel them. And she's like, your aunt is in town from New York. You're going to stay because we're doing a big dinner. And I was like, I don't want to stay. And so my aunt basically turned around and backhanded me across the mouth. Not even my mom, my aunt turned around. And I remember thinking, and then I got punished. And I was like, I had basically doomed myself for the rest of the weekend. And so I always remember that as my reckless rage moment. I was really angry, and then my aunt just like, and she was like, snap out of it. And my aunt's a true New Yorker, with the whole New York accent and everything, right? Just take a New Yorican and give her some New York attitude, and it's crazy. So I remember being so angry, but they were right. I was being selfish about my time, and my aunt was in town, and she was only there for a week, and I needed to spend time with my aunt. So my reckless rage moment. And I think we all have that. And I think that's part of the conversation here is at 13, you can connect with this text, right? For sure. But then what happens after reckless rage? Chapter 3, he comes, but after 10 minutes alone in the dark street, a new emotion overtook him, panic. Whichever way he looked at it, he had never been in a worse fix. He was stranded, quite alone in the dark Muggle world with absolutely nowhere to go. And the worst of it was he had done serious magic, which meant that he was almost certainly expelled from Hogwarts. He had broken the decree for the restriction of underage wizardry so badly, he was surprised Ministry of Magic representatives weren't swooping down on him where he sat. Harry shivered and looked up and down Magnolia Crescent. What was going to happen to him? Would he be arrested? or would he simply be outlawed from the wizarding world? He thought of Ron and Hermione, and his heart sank even lower. Harry was sure that, criminal or not, Ron and Hermione would want to help him now, but they were both abroad, and with Hedwig gone, he had no means of contacting them. He didn't have any Muggle money either. There was a little wizard gold in his money bag at the bottom of his trunk, but the rest of the fortune his parents had left him was stored in a vault at Gringotts Wizarding Bank in London. He'd never been able to drag he'd never be able to drag his trunk all the way to London unless, right? So, right after reckless rage, what comes? What's that next emotion besides panic? What's the next thing? What can you describe this next feeling as that he has? Guilt. I like guilt. Yes. It's like coming down to earth, right? Yeah. He's like, oh, I'm in deep, right? Worried. Maybe a little bit of regret as well. I always think regret is a good one to add to this. These are all good answers. Yeah. Realization, reality hits, right? He's definitely realizing that he is in a very deep state. If he has no way to get around, he's 13, he's out in the dark. Okay. And at the same time that this is happening, he's realizing somebody's watching him, right? Or something is watching him. So he trips, and he sticks out his wand hand with his wand, and here comes the night bus. What is the night bus? It's one of the questions on the slide in front of you. What is the night bus? And then why does Harry lie about his name? What is the night bus and why does Harry lie?
The night bus is like a transportation service for stranded witches and wizards, and it's also like an allusion to the old trope of like a knight in shining armor, because it kind of comes out of nowhere, and he lied about his name so that he would keep a low profile, and also because he thought that the the ministry was after him.
Yeah, so the night bus, yeah, I like the idea of the night bus with the trope of the knight in shining armor, but it's a deep purple colored bus. That it exists. You know, you can see the night bus. They have one at Universal Studios in Orlando, which is kind of cool. And the one that's in the picture here on the screen, I believe, is on the Warner Brothers studio lot in London. I think they have one there, and I think they have one at the Universal Studios lot in California. So I think there's about 3 of them. And they're kind of cool. It's a double-decker bus. It's typical for England to have double-decker buses. That's how they get more people around the city, especially in London. You get double-decker buses constantly. London is a huge city. So getting around is not easy unless you use the London Underground, which is their metro system, their subway system underneath, or you use buses. The other way to get around England is by taxi as well. The taxis in London are world famous for being, they have memorized the entire street system. It's an old city. There's sections of it that are very old, and so the streets are not exactly like straight in a pattern. So they're notoriously famous, the taxi drivers, for knowing all of London. The other thing is, why does Harry lie about his name, right? One, I like, yeah, Yvette has the right answer. He lies about his name in case they go looking for him and they won't go directly to the bus. But whose name does he use? The Neville Longbottom, yes. And this is really important because this starts to set the theme for disguise and duality. Many of the characters in this book use disguise and another, they have another duality, right? So you're going to see that as a big theme. This is the first time we see it as him using the idea of a disguise. Like, I'll pretend to be somebody else. If they come looking for me, I'm Neville Longbottom, right? And he gets on this crazy double-decker bus, and it's a great ride along the city. And he also learns about Sirius Black on the bus on page 37. So then the first plot line is always Harry and his top level, right, detective section. And there's always another subplot as well too. We start to see that this subplot about Sirius Black is going to interfere into Harry's plot, right? So we have this first one that is going to interfere. Sirius Black on page 37, we find out who he is. I talked to you already about Sirius Black's name, and how the Black family had a lot of names that were from constellations. And of course, the star Sirius, right, is a major constellation. It's called the Canis Major. And so it's a lot of illusion, and it's also called the Dog Star. So this is her laying all those illusions to give us a hint as to who Sirius Black is and what he is. So when you read it when you're a kid, when you're 13, you may not realize Sirius Black. You just think, it's just the name, right? But it's not. There's more to it. I have an outdoor cat that I named Sirius Black. I have a couple feral cats in my neighborhood. One doesn't have a tail. I call him Bob. And then the other one is Sirius Black. He's a he's a really big black cat, really kind of fluffy. And I just call him Sirius Black. And he just walks around my neighborhood. I don't actually feed him. Somebody else is feeding him, but he always comes in my backyard at night, and I see him out my back doors. And I'm like, oh, there's Sirius. And he just comes around skulking at night. And it's always late at night. So I named him Sirius Black. He's all black, and he's got a little, like, teeny white spot on his chest. So I always thought that he looked like a star. So that's why I named him that. So the other thing is we meet Stan Shunpike. Who is Stan Shunpike? We meet him on page 33. And I know that this is kind of silly because Stan Shunpike is not an important character, but Stan Shunpike shows up being mentioned in book 7. He is the conductor of the night bus. So yes, Stephanie, you are right. He works on the night bus. You got the right answer. His name shows up again in book 7, where somebody says that he's turned bad, but Harry Potter comes to his defense and says Stan Shunpike would never have done that. I met him. He's just not that kind of person, right? And so even Harry remembers Stan Shunpike. So it's one of those names that shows up and then you don't see it again for a long time. And then you book 7, it pops up and you're like, I've heard this name. This is why it's in book 3. Okay. The other thing we learned a couple things that set the plot. Okay. On page 37, 38, we get the article Black Still at Large. Okay. So we get a newspaper article within the text again, right? That epistolary kind of like text within a text. It's very postmodern, by the way, as a postmodern writers to use